Okay. So now we're going to talk about, I'm going to kind of go about this a little bit differently. We're going to look at kind of the impact of culture after World War II and kind of look at kind of the progression of several key cultural kind of things. Some of this will dovetail a little bit with the civil rights movement and the expansion of civil liberties and specific citizenship rights to groups of people that had been denied. But it's also going to touch on some of the stuff from the 1950s. And I think it helps you grasp that really the social changes that come into the 1960s, particularly the 1970s, are really rooted in what's going to be going on after World War II. And I think it helps you to kind of understand that. We'll also look specifically at the Cold War in relation to JFK. And I'll probably end up doing Vietnam separately because I think this is probably going to take too long. If I try to do all three at one time. So I mentioned before this idea of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. And again, this is kind of tied into this emerging tension with the Soviet Union. I've already mentioned to you, you have the Potsdam Conference in 1945. You're going to have the Long Telegram in 1946. And so you're also going to see that the Soviets will develop a nuclear weapon. And you're going to have some evidence of kind of concerns about U.S. spying in our nuclear program during World War II. Those are the Venona papers, and that's going to lead to real concerns that we need to make sure of people's loyalty. And when you look at NSC 68, you'll definitely see kind of the influence of this concern. And so we'll see, I believe it's in 48, that we have loyalty review boards where they're looking at government employees and saying, hey, are you going to take an oath? They made teachers take an oath that they wouldn't teach communist ideas in school. It'd probably get me in trouble. No, I don't teach communist ideas, but I certainly teach a critical approach towards understanding U.S. history. And there was a real concern that kind of critique could lead to kind of a kind of dissent and dissension in the American public. The House Un-American Activities Committee, also known as HUAC, you want to be sure you know that. This is where Senator Joseph McCarthy comes in. He'll start. McCarthy is a senator from Wisconsin. Ted Cruz makes me think a lot of McCarthy. And what you kind of see there is that he really just kind of comes out of nowhere, really kind of makes his name by making these statements about communism and really trying to appeal to like the fear of communism in like 1948. And he'll be put on this House Un-American Activities Committee, as Richard Nixon will be on that committee as well. And he'll give this speech to some women's group, and I don't remember now which city he was in, but he basically says, I have a list of names of people in the State Department who have questionable loyalty and all this kind of stuff. And he gets a lot of press coverage for this. And so this is kind of how HUAC begins to move from having loyalty review boards and just kind of keeping an eye on trends about communism and un-American activities, right? Because actually the Un-American Activities Committee actually has its roots in World War II, and kind of forgot to mention that. So kind of morphs and develops into the early Cold War as watching out for communism as opposed to, say, fascism. And so McCarthy will say, I have this list of names, and everybody will freak out. And so they'll start doing these investigations and calling people up. And it'll very much become this kind of witch hunt. If you've read The Crucible, you're familiar. I mean, that's basically an allegory for the HUAC and the Red Scare and all that McCarthyism. And so they're going to focus not only on government positions and kind of targeting that, but they're also going to focus Hollywood and films and TV. And NSC 68 will kind of mention that, that we needed to be concerned about the influence of the media on the American public. And so you're going to have kind of this idea of blacklists and persecutions and that kind of thing. What will be McCarthy's undoing is he'll target the U.S. Army. And when he does that, you're talking about about people who were World War II veterans. And so it's going to end up making him look really, really bad. And so he's going to finish his term as senator and then kind of disappear into nothingness and basically drink himself into an early grave. So you need to be sure you know HUAC and kind of what its purpose was. You also need to be concerned, or not concerned, you need to remember that the U.S. was concerned about spying and espionage. This is a big deal. This is kind of that CIA period of the 1950s, that kind of thing. People like Alger Hiss, who gets targeted, and his conviction actually ends up getting overturned, I believe. Maybe I'm confusing him with Ellsberg. Anyways. And then you have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who will actually be executed. And of course, the Rosenbergs were guilty of spying, but it was very low-level spying. And they basically, leave like 2 kids orphaned. And Ethel Rosenberg in particular was very kind of somewhat innocent. I mean, she helped her husband, but it was mostly because it was just her husband. It was her husband that was more directly involved. But they showed no mercy to either one of them. So you want to be sure you're familiar with McCarthyism. And of course, kind of the causes and effects of it. This idea of, appearing tough on communism, this concern about the stalemate in Korea and all that kind of stuff, the atomic bomb. And then as well, this idea of loyalty oaths and the persecution, and kind of this move away from labor unions and that kind of thing. And it's really McCarthyism is a part of this idealistic view we have of the 1950s, this idea of conformity, that we all have to look the same and be the same in the cookie cutter approach. Now, some of that's the impact of suburbs and the mass consumerism and all that kind of stuff. But some of it too is this pressure of, I don't want to look different. Now, this is important because this fear of I don't want to look different is going to help create the culture of the teenager, right? It's going to help create the culture of beatniks, and beatniks will then become the hippies of the 60s and 70s. So you definitely see this focus on communism is going to have its own backlash, and it's going to affect the culture. And so McCarthyism, not only with HUAC and McCarthy and that kind of thing, and the fear of communism, but it also has this impact on kind of affecting this concept of conformity with this idea of being different and looking different and acting different. And so you have, in addition to that, because of the prosperity, because of the number of children, the expansion of the suburbs, you have a lot of expansion of education with the GI Bill, expansion of public education. Remember, we don't want a bunch of 16 and 17-year-old kids out job hunting, so we were going to keep them in school. We're going to kind of, one of the things we want to do, and this kind of will make sense with NSC 68, is define American society as being very different from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was, their kids were working and taking on responsibilities and all that kind of stuff at a very young age. So part of what American society was doing, in addition to doing things like adding, one nation under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, is they're turning around and, extending education and basically creating this kind of society of a teenager. This is where our school system becomes so very focused on being well-rounded and all that kind of stuff. And so, that's going to be very, very important. But the constant fear of an atomic bomb, of nuclear weapons, what will happen if a bomb drops tomorrow, right? And the famous Duck and Cover cartoon, which hopefully somebody will remind me, I'll show it to you in class, that's going to have this persistent fear for people. And so young people who want to be hopeful, want to look for the future, are going to reject kind of that constant pressure. And they're going to start focusing on this idea of, finding themselves and experiencing kind of this inner enlightenment. And if you look at anything, whether it's Rebel Without a Cause or East of Eden, which are famous films from the 1950s, you see that a lot of influence of kind of the teenager there. And there's a lot of media that will kind of reflect that. Even the existence of rock and roll music is about teenagers rejecting the music of their parents and embracing instead the music of their generation, right? So Elvis Presley and the Everly Brothers and all that kind of stuff, they're a part of that, of young people looking at their parents and going, yeah, we know that you fought, World War II and survived the Great Depression, but we want to do something different. We want to be different. And you've created a world where there's a constant atomic weapon and we're terrified of communists and all this kind of stuff. So that's going to be very, very different. The Beat movement is kind of the beginning of that. These are going to be intellectuals who challenge the conformity and that kind of thing. And the children of this World War II generation, they're going to have greater access to higher education in a way that previous generations had never had. And so all that higher education, one of the purposes of college is to get you to question your assumptions and to think outside the box, and all this going to expose you to more information. Well, when you expose people to information and knowledge, you change the way they think. And so it's understandable that when you get to the 1960s, you're going to have that expansion of thinking in a way that we hadn't seen before. The Beat generation is a term that's used specifically to refer to a group of American writers who really are about rejecting that conformity, about rejecting this message of the 1950s, looking for individuality. So there's kind of this real irony of the Beat generation and teenagers looking for individuality, even as there's a level of conformity. If you look at teenage consumerism of the 1950s, the emphasis on, we all want to consume the same thing. We all want to kind of live the same way, consume the same music, all that kind of stuff. And yet at the same time, they're encouraging themselves to, explore new music, new literature, all that kind of stuff. So some of the names that you'll want to recognize: Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs. These names occasionally pop up on the STAR test referring to the Beat generation. There should be enough context clues if that were to happen, that would allow you to go, oh, this is the Beat generation. This is what we're talking about. So I don't know that you have to stress about remembering Ginsberg's name. But you do definitely need to know the Beat generation, that they were a part of this kind of new movement. And they really are kind of the precursors to the hippies. I mentioned rock and roll music being a big part of kind of the teenagers, so be sure you know that. And again, kind of this positive impact is that really this is kind of culture, just like we saw with jazz music. Rock and roll is going to blend black and white culture, black and white music styles together. So you're going to see that happening. And it's going to kind of give young people kind of a separate kind of cultural sense. And you're going to see that there's a lot of social causes that will come out of rock and roll music, whether it's Vietnam War protests, whether it's civil rights, and later in the 1980s, we're looking at, famine in Africa, or, the struggle of farmers, that kind of thing. So understand that rock and roll music, while it's definitely a cultural kind of reaction against conformity, it also will have good things to go with it as well. And so you're definitely going to see that the counterculture movement that will emerge in the 60s and 70s is really going to have its foundation in this kind of focus on conformity. So now we're going to think about the impact of the higher education and the impact of just the sheer numbers of young people, these baby boomers. Of course, now they're all retirement age, but back then they were all going to college. And because they're exploring ideas and they're really educating themselves, they'll create kind of the foundation for what will be the new left, the far liberal kind of side of politics. Students for Democratic Society they're going to have multiple issues talking about an end to consumerism and corporate domination, and they're going to be very critical of the Vietnam War. They'll use protests. So a lot of the protests we'll talk about with the Vietnam movement, the civil rights movement, and all that kind of stuff are going to have its foundation in that. Free speech movement, fighting kind of the university systems, because you're going to have university systems that are very traditional, that children are supposed to do what they're told, and that young people in their 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds, that they have to follow the rules. And yet you have this huge number of young people on college campuses that say, wait a minute, you're not letting us express our free speech. You're telling us that we can't express our political viewpoints, and that's not right either. The emergence of environmentalism, thanks to, again, college education, science, this idea of scientific method and really studying and evaluating the impact of industrialization, particularly industrialization as we see it emerging after World War II. So Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, will come out. One of the technological developments related to agriculture is going to be the use of pesticides, the heavy use of pesticides. And of course, if you're familiar with the GMO argument now, you know what pesticides can do really bad things. And so she's going to study this, and she's going to say, DDT is creating more problems than it's solving. And they're going to point to smog and water pollution. So environmentalism is going to become a big thing in the 1960s. We'd seen it be a big thing in the early 1900s, but it had kind of faded away in the pressures of the prosperity of the 1920s and the problems of the 30s and 40s. In the 1950s, people had just kind of forgotten about it. So we rediscover environmental concerns in the 1960s. By the time you get to the 1970s, you're going to have Earth Day, the EPA, and all that kind of stuff is going to emerge under Nixon. So just kind of stick that in the back of your mind as being kind of a product of really the education and the studies of the 1950s, and really kind of question that. The idea of consumerism, of consumer safety, is going to emerge because of the mass consumption of the 1950s. Ralph Nader is going to be one of those people. He's still around. Counterculture, again, these young people coming from the 1960s, they'll start going to school in the early 60s. And at first, it's not about counterculture. At first, it's about kind of this youthful exuberance and knowledge, and we want to make a difference, and we want to change the world around us and all this kind of stuff. And this will be part of kind of the momentum of John F. Kennedy. But what we'll see happening is that the counterculture movement will really, as we get farther into the 1960s, as stuff starts to come out about the Vietnam War, there's going to be a real rejection of kind of the status quo, and that life that had brought us into 1968 wasn't always truthful. Right? And this is one of the problems with conformity, is that we know that true conformity doesn't really exist, and that there's all these variations and all this diversity. And so the counterculture is really going to reject that focus on we all have to be the same. And again, this is tangled up with a lot of other things that are going on. And so you're going to have this focus on inner spirituality, finding yourself, drug usage to kind of find your consciousness and that kind of thing. And lots of other churches are going to, non-traditional churches, right, are going to emerge there. Now, we'll have a conservative backlash to this counterculture movement when you start to get into the late 1970s. But you definitely have kind of this period of the 60s going into the early 70s where, really anything went as far as culture and religion and spirituality and drug usage and alcohol consumption. And of course, part of what the hippies are saying are that, the parents of the 1950s were busy drinking their martinis and having cocktail parties and smoking cigarettes. I mean, this is when you have those ads with the doctors, hey, I smoke a Camel a day, right? And look how healthy I am. And so the hippies are going to really kind of reject that and say, this doesn't make sense, that you can't say that I can't, use drugs to expand my consciousness when you're using alcohol to escape, your frustration with conformity and your frustration with your middle-class life and your suburban job and all that kind of stuff. You're going to also see that emerging in the 1960s when we start to reject all that focus of the strict gender roles and all that kind of stuff at the 50s, the emergence of feminism, and you're going to have a lot more awareness of social inequality and lack of job opportunity. And we'll talk more specifically when we get to civil rights about things like Title IX and the EEOC and equal pay. But you need to recognize now in the feminist movement as kind of being a byproduct of kind of moving away from all that strict gender role stuff. You want to be sure you know the name Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique. That's kind of the beginning of the women's movement that's going to take place in the early 1960s. Gloria Steinem and the National Organization for Women in 1966. By the time you get to the early 1970s, you're looking at Roe v. Wade. In the mid 60s, you have birth control, and that's really going to be a game changer for women, especially for young women. When you think about the number of young women that are on college campuses, that are away from their parents. And so now, just kind of like we saw with the automobile in the 1920s, giving women new freedom, birth control is going to give these granddaughters of the 1960s new freedom as well, and freedom from having to worry about an unplanned pregnancy. Now, this will have a conservative backlash with the Equal Rights Amendment and Phyllis Schlafly, where they'll basically argue that feminism has caused women to abandon their traditional roles. But again, remember that traditional roles for women in the 1950s were the exception, not the rule. And, so this is part of that bigger picture. Just some pictures from national organization and women kind of uniting. You're also going to see, if you think back to the Bracero program of World War II, you had lots of Mexican immigrants. You had, Mexican Americans, kind of another wave of Mexican immigration because of the 1940s. And a lot of that's going to be done in agriculture, right? I mean, not universally, but that's going to be one of the initial, attractions of the Bracero program, and, kind of those industrial jobs, that kind of thing. And so it's into this that you're going to start to have kind of an awareness of, Latino culture and Latino American culture, whether it's Mexican American or kind of Latino as kind of a broad umbrella for any Latin American kind of country. And so whether you're talking about Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union, or LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is going to really emerge. LULAC's going to be part of the American GI Forum that comes from World War II and Mexican American contributions in World War II. La Raza Unida, focusing on cultural identity and bilingual identity and all this kind of stuff. So definitely World War II, you see kind of these groups coming from this period. So while the 1950s talk so much about conformity, the impact of all these different groups working together in World War II is actually going to result in kind of all these new kind of civil rights groups. American Indian movement's also going to be a part of this. They're going to be a part of the civil rights movement. And again, think about the Navajo contribution to World War II. And you're going to have, because you had such pressure for there's this one mainstream culture, what you'll see is as we try to force everybody, it's kind of like when you pack a suitcase too full, we're going to make everything fit into this suitcase and it's going to be this mainstream culture and it's all going to look this way. And yet what happens is we find we can't fit all that diversity into American culture. There's too many differences. And while, the 1920s had focused on prosperity and let's all make money, and the 1930s focused on none of us have money, and the 1940s focused on, hey, we're all fighting World War II. When you get to the 1950s, once we start to get accustomed to the Cold War and the pressures of the Soviet Union, what you're going to see is that you're going to have these different groups kind of branch off of that, and that kind of thing. So you're going to have that's going to happen, the American Indian movement. And again, we'll go into more detail with these groups when we talk about the civil rights movement. I'm just trying to make sure that you link this with the 1950s and kind of see this as a bridge between the things that are put in place in the 1950s and the Cold War and those tensions and the education and the population growth and how it's going to result in these changes in the 1960s. Again, you're going to have American culture is going to influence the world, lots of globalization. You're going to have global treaties after World War II, the GATT, and you're going to have treaties about kind of creating this global trade. Well, the impact of global trade after World War II and in the 1950s will be, number one, this exchange of culture, American culture with Europe, European culture with America, but it's also going to lead to increased pressure by the time you get to the late 60s and early 70s of American manufacturing. So don't separate kind of this changing world that we have happening there. And this is going to be a huge impact on foreign policy in the 70s and 80s. So you can't isolate the interdependence, the economic systems, and what will happen in the 70s when we talk about Nixon. And if you've looked around my room, because this is what my classes have been talking about this week, is Nixon in the 70s and 80s. This is going to tie directly to what we see happening with globalization. And this is all tied to kind of this expanded global economy after World War II, the Marshall Plan, all that kind of stuff. So be sure that you understand that. And hopefully if we have time, we'll look at some of these videos. But for now, or if you can go to the PowerPoint and pull it up, this particular PowerPoint's going to be in my regular lecture notes, whereas I think I also have it in with some of the dual credit lecture notes and that kind of thing. I think I'm going to stop this here because this is probably taken about 20-25 minutes. And I know I'm going to need more time to talk about the Cold War and to talk about things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and that sort of thing. So I'll stop here and we'll just leave it at that. And we'll end up having like 2 more lectures because Vietnam I know will take way more and it'll need to be kind of a standalone lecture too. All right.